will construct new bus rapid transit lines in cities like Columbus and Cincinnati, really in all regions of the country. It would finally tackle the repair backlog in the transit industry, estimated now to be in excess of $100 billion. President Biden and I also agree on the need to replace aging transit buses with zero-emission vehicles made right here in America. The jobs plan would allow us to replace 50,000 buses. The administration recognizes the importance of ensuring that investments in housing and transit work together, of encouraging communities to think about how they can help make it affordable for families to live there. We know when a business decides where to build a new manufacturing facility, or a young family decides whether to relocate for a new job, they don't only consider one factor. They think about how they'll get to work, how long will the commute be, will their whole paycheck get eaten up by rent or mortgage, is there broadband at home, is there childcare nearby that they can afford. These pieces fit together. Communities need all of them if we want them to survive and thrive. While much of today's conversation will focus on housing and transit investments, we must tackle all of these critical investments. Brent Spence Bridge over the Ohio River in Secretary Fudge's in my home state that connects Cincinnati and northern Kentucky carries approximately 3% of our nation's GDP, but that bridge is dangerously outdated. Brent Spence is far from the only one. Our committee member states have thousands of large and small bridges in need of repair. Those bridges carry millions of cars and buses every day. I look forward to working with both secretaries in the Bridge Investment Act to make sure that Congress finally tackles overdue bridge projects. We call this the American Jobs Plan for a reason. Almost all these jobs will be here. They can't be shipped overseas. You can't repair an American railroad track or an American bridge from China. We're going to build new buses and rail cars and homes in America with American raw materials and American union workers. The president called this a blue-collar blueprint to rebuild America. He's right. We need bold action to protect our communities, to build infrastructure, protect them from climate disasters, to put Americans to work in good-paying jobs. The two former mayors today from Warrensville Heights and South Bend, these two mayors know the pride people take in their neighborhoods and their hometowns. People want to see their communities thrive and grow. They want job opportunity for their kids. They want transportation and housing options they can afford. And local leaders of both parties are desperate. I talk to mayors and county commissioners all the time. Actually, in Ohio, there are many more Republicans than Democrats in those offices. They're desperate for the resources and support to make those dreams a reality. For decades, they've watched Washington point to soaring stock prices as evidence the economy is doing well. Yet their communities too often aren't. That Wall Street wealth never translated into investment in their own main streets. We change that approach starting now. I look forward to hearing from both our witnesses, Secretary Marcia Fudge, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Senator Toomey's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Fudge and Secretary Buttigieg, welcome to both of you. The topic of today's hearing is an important one. It's infrastructure. A week ago, I met with President Biden and a group of my Republican colleagues to discuss a potential bipartisan infrastructure package. Secretary Buttigieg was there. It was a constructive meeting, and I'm encouraged by the president's apparent willingness to negotiate with Republicans. I would suggest that there should be three features of an infrastructure package if it's going to have broad bipartisan support. First, it should responsibly boost support for real, that is to say, physical infrastructure. That's the platforms that we share, the platforms and systems that we use to move peoples and goods and services throughout our economy. Those are things that most Americans understand to be infrastructure. Things like roads and bridges and ports and airports and transit. Second, a package that we agreed to cannot undo the 2017 tax reforms that helped create the best economy of my lifetime. Remember, before COVID, just a little over a year ago, we were experiencing an almost unprecedented economic boom. We had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, all-time record low unemployment for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, many other subsets of our population. We had more job openings than there were people looking for jobs. We had record low poverty rate. We had wages growing across the board, but they were growing fastest for the lowest income workers. So this economy was narrowing the income gap while it was performing at a spectacular pace. I'm suggesting it'd be a good thing to get back to the best economy of my lifetime. So we won't get there if we undo the tax reform that helped us achieve that. Third, we should not pay for a big infrastructure package by borrowing or printing hundreds of billions of more dollars. Now, the good news on this front is we have hundreds of billions of unspent COVID-related legislated funds that Congress can repurpose to pay for the infrastructure. According to CBO, over $700 billion just of the Democrats' March so-called COVID bill won't be spent even by the end of this year. And in fact, the Biden administration has already begun repurposing unneeded excess COVID funds from previous bills. HHS has diverted $1.7 billion that was originally meant for COVID, and they're using that instead for unaccompanied minors at the border. So what Congress should not do is simply go on a spending binge of more taxpayer dollars on a liberal wish list that expands the welfare state. Let's take housing, for example. The Biden administration is now proposing almost $250 billion for housing in an infrastructure plan. So first of all, let's be clear. Housing is housing. Housing is not infrastructure. Of course, people need houses. They also need food and clothing and education and healthcare. That doesn't mean that every human need is infrastructure. It's not. We can reach an agreement on infrastructure. But they want to spend, the administration that is, $250 billion on top of the fact that just this past March, that was 2 months ago, they spent $32 billion for housing. And that came after Congress had provided, over the course of last year, $80 billion for housing, which itself was on top of the roughly $50 billion we spend annually on HUD alone, not to mention the billions we spend on other housing programs. If you've lost track of all the tens of billions of dollars, it's because it's really hard to keep it straight. It's a staggering amount of money. It's a similar story on the administration's transit proposal. The Biden administration wants to spend another $85 billion for transit as part of this infrastructure bill. That would come after the Democrats in March spent $30 billion for transit, which itself came after $40 billion last year for transit, and that was on top of the $13 billion that we annually spend on transit. So in case you weren't using a calculator to keep track, that's $83 billion that Congress spent on transit just over the course of 1 year. That number actually exceeds the annual operating and capital costs combined of every single transit agency in America for a full year. Well, our Democratic colleagues point to a decline in ridership, but ridership didn't drop to zero. And if it had, we'd have to ask ourselves whether we should be throwing all this money at a system that has no riders, right? And in addition, state and local governments ought to have some responsibility for this. And we sent them $850 billion on top of last year's all-time record high collection of revenue. Some of the provisions in this in the administration's so-called infrastructure plan are so unrelated, completely unrelated to infrastructure, that it's hard to even consider them with a straight face. $400 billion to expand Medicaid, $100 billion in consumer subsidies and rebates to purchase electronic vehicles. The list goes on and on. Only 6% of the administration's $2.2 trillion so-called infrastructure plan actually goes to roads and bridges. So this kind of excessive government spending is not sustainable. It's contributing to inflation that is already with us. That inflation is essentially an extra tax that all of our constituents have to bear when they buy any of the things they need in life. And none of this should come as a surprise. Even President Obama's Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, warned us of the negative inflationary risks of excessive spending. And he was issuing that warning about the Democrats' bill in March, which at $1.9 trillion he thought was much too big. They passed it anyway, and now our Democratic colleagues are coming back to spend literally trillions more. Let me end where I began. In my view, I do think it's possible for us to enact a bipartisan bill that responsibly boosts federal support for real physical infrastructure. And if all sides are willing to negotiate in good faith, I think an agreement can be struck. But I hope we will focus on that real infrastructure that our economy and society needs, and do it in a responsible fashion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I will now introduce our witnesses, the Honorable Marcia Fudge, my former congressman from Ohio's 11th District, has spent her career fighting for better opportunities for Ohioans. She has firsthand experience making housing more affordable for more families, including as the mayor of Warrensville Heights, Ohio. We're fortunate she's now applying her expertise across the nation. It was an honor to chair the hearing reporting her nomination out of this committee. It was my first hearing as chair of this committee. She was our first nominee reported out since I've been chairman. It's an honor to work with a fellow Ohioan as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Welcome, Secretary Fudge. Glad you're with us. Our other witness, the Honorable Pete Buttigieg, served as mayor of South Bend, Indiana, state just to the west of mine. Mayor Pete showed his passion and creativity in using infrastructure to improve the well-being of workers and businesses in South Bend, implementing a smart streets initiative that was recognized by US DOT as a national model. Now with Secretary Pete at the helm, DOT is in position to transform streets, bridges, railways, and transit systems across America, all using our greatest asset, American workers. Our country is very fortunate. Welcome, Secretary Buttigieg. Secretary Fudge, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to provide your opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to see you, and thank you on behalf of all Ohioans for the great work you do for your state. Mr. Ranking Member, Mr. Toomey, and the distinguished members of the Senate Banking Committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss President Biden's American Jobs Plan. Today, as America rebuilds from COVID-19 pandemic, we face a fundamental decision about our future. We can choose to take a bold new direction that will make the United States more prosperous, more equitable, and more resilient in decades to come. A bold new direction that better positions us to win the global competition for the 21st century. That bold new direction is the American Jobs Plan. If we do not pass this plan, we will choose instead a very different path. We will return our nation to the position we occupied before COVID-19, to an America beset by crumbling bridges, buildings, and homes, an America unprepared for the existential danger posed by climate change, an America grappling with an affordable housing crisis that threatens the security and the dignity of people in every corner of our nation. Even before the pandemic, nearly 11 million Americans spent more than half of their incomes on rent. COVID-19 has only made this situation worse, especially for communities of color and people of modest means. The American Jobs Plan would address our housing crisis head on in cities, small towns, rural communities, and tribal nations. The plan invests $213 billion to build and modernize more than 2 million affordable and sustainable places to live. To help more Americans realize their dream of homeownership, the plan includes a new federal tax credit based on the proposed Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. This credit can lead to the construction and renovation of approximately 500,000 single-family homes. In addition to creating more housing, the American Jobs Plan preserves the affordable housing we already have. Nearly 2 million people, including more than 1 million Americans of color, live in public housing. Yet much of our public housing is more than 50 years old and faces significant capital needs. The American Jobs Plan contains $40 billion down payments to help repair and rehabilitate our public housing infrastructure. This would dramatically improve the quality of life for residents. Furthermore, public housing is often located in underserved communities that are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Investments that reduce energy use and increase resiliency can mitigate these risks. This plan will help make America's homes and public housing more efficient and better equipped to withstand extreme weather. In addition, this plan advances equity for tribal nations. It contains $2 billion in Indian housing block grants to expand affordable housing, resilient infrastructure, and sustainable community development in tribal lands. All told, the investment in the American Jobs Plan underscore a fundamental truth, that housing is a vital part of our infrastructure. A secure and stable home represents more than 4 walls and a roof. It can connect us to better jobs, more affordable transportation options, and communities with cleaner air and cleaner water. It can connect our children with good schools, providing them with a pathway to earn a brighter future. Our homes are bedrock, brick, and mortar institutions that lay the foundation for a stronger and more connected society, just like our streets, our highways, and our airports. To put it simply, our homes serve as a bridge to greater opportunities for a better life. If we want the United States to remain the greatest nation in the world, then we must first take care of home in the most literal sense. To pass an infrastructure plan that fails to address our affordable housing crisis would be akin to building a road that leads to nowhere. That is why I am honored to appear today alongside Secretary Buttigieg. The Biden-Harris administration understands that in order to successfully enact the jobs plan, our two agencies must work in unison to help build more sustainable infrastructure and expand access to both affordable housing and affordable options for transportation. Together, we can help revitalize our nation's infrastructure, including our housing infrastructure, and create an America that is more thriving, more resilient, and more interconnected than ever before. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you so
Thank you,
much, Mr.
Secretary
Chairman.
Fudge. Secretary Buttigieg, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today, and I want to thank you for your support for the Department of Transportation and our vital mission. I'm very honored to be here with Secretary Fudge to discuss America's transportation and housing needs, particularly in this moment of great challenge and opportunity. We know that public transit has been hit hard by the pandemic. And I want to thank you and your colleagues for passing the American Rescue Plan and other relief packages that provided a lifeline for public transit, for the people who depend on it, and for the essential transit workers who get people where they need to go. Public transit is key to building vibrant and interconnected communities, creating jobs, reducing pollution, combating climate change, advancing racial equity, and providing travel options for everyone. Too many families across the nation are forced to choose between living impossibly far away from work so they can afford housing, or paying more for housing than they can afford in order to have a reasonable commute. This puts a toll on working families who lose precious time with their loved ones and money needed for other essentials. Our lowest income Americans are spending more on housing and transportation than they're taking in each month. Building transit and affordable housing alongside each other can be transformational for communities and families. That's why I'm so grateful to be sitting next to Secretary Fudge, virtually of course, at this hearing. When people can move safely and easily in their community by public transit, foot, bike, wheelchair, or any other means, it can improve the lives of those who call that community home. That's why transit-oriented development and public transit are such priorities for our department and for me personally. We've already made $180 million available for cleaner transit buses. We allocated $187 million to help communities expand bus rapid transit. We recently made $10 million available to help more local governments plan for transit-oriented development in their communities. I'm also pleased to announce that DOT will soon issue new guidance to help local communities and other prospective borrowers use the department's transit-oriented development financing programs. And I'm thrilled that DOT is reinvigorating a partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development to identify ways to provide more affordable housing choices near high-quality public transit. We are looking for opportunities to work with additional agencies, including the EPA and the Department of Agriculture, to make walking, biking, public transit, and other transportation options more widely available to disadvantaged and rural communities. These important steps will benefit communities across the country, but we must do far more. We face a $1 trillion backlog in needed repairs and improvements across our transportation infrastructure. The consequences of decades of disinvestment are felt in every state and have fallen most heavily on low-income communities and communities of color who are nearly 4 times more likely to commute by public transit. Our status quo is unsustainable. It's unfair, and it's holding our people and economy back. And years of tinkering around the edges have not worked, which brings us to President Biden's American Jobs Plan. It is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to meet this moment. As we rebuild from the worst economic crisis in generations, this plan will provide the largest investment in American jobs since World War II, all with protections for existing labor standards. It will create millions of good-paying jobs, the majority of which will not require a college degree, for Americans to help expand and operate our public transit system, modernize our roads and bridges, and build the electric vehicles of the future. It will double federal investment, $85 billion, for public transit, making it a more reliable, attractive, and accessible option to more people in more communities. It'll help us tackle the climate crisis by making public transit the option of choice for more people, by building a network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers, and by replacing nearly 40% of the existing diesel transit vehicle fleet with electric vehicles. Chairman Brown, I thank you for your leadership on reducing fossil fuel emissions in the transportation sector and for ensuring that the vehicles of the future are built by union workers here in the U.S. This plan would also be the largest investment in transportation equity in history. At least 40% of the benefits of the plan's climate investments will flow to overburdened and underserved communities, and the plan has $20 billion to reconnect neighborhoods cut off by past transportation decisions, as well as another $20 billion to improve road safety for all users. I believe this is the best chance in our lifetime to modernize our infrastructure so Americans can thrive. Our chance to provide current and future generations with the types of investments our forebears gave us in the New Deal, and this time to include all Americans in the opportunities that come from that investment. Looking forward to working with this committee to deliver for the American people. Thank you for the chance to testify and look forward to the opportunity to respond to questions.
Sharon, I think you're muted.
Senator Brown, you're muted.
Chris, we are having some technical difficulties with the chairman's mic. Ranking Member Toomey, would you mind going first?
That's fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, terrific. I will go first. So back in March, a couple of months ago, our Democratic colleagues passed a spending bill that provided $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers to be distributed to people experiencing homelessness, victims of human trafficking, and other circumstances. Under that law and HUD's own regulations, illegal immigrants are not eligible for these vouchers. But just yesterday, Fox Business reported that HUD recently issued guidance that will have the effect of making it easier for illegal immigrants to obtain these emergency housing vouchers that are supposed to be meant for Americans. This happens because, as I understand it, the new guidance waives an existing HUD regulation that requires public housing authorities to obtain and verify documentation that an applicant for a housing voucher actually has a legal immigration status as opposed to an illegal status at the time of application. HUD's own regulations say that this requirement, the one that HUD is waiving, if this report is accurate, this requirement is meant to, quote, decrease the incidence of fraud, waste, and abuse, end quote. HUD's guidance may now allow illegal immigrants to obtain these housing vouchers that, as I said, are meant for American citizens. So, Secretary Fudge, isn't it important that we follow the law and the HUD regulation and have processes in place to minimize the risk that these vouchers go to people who are not supposed to have them?
Yes, Senator, indeed it is. And I thank you for the question. I think that it is very, very clear from our May 5th public notice detailing the operating requirements for the Emergency Housing Vouchers Program. It is clear that in line with current law, eligibility for assistance is limited to United States citizens and those with legal residency.
Right, but I'm concerned that this guidance, by waiving this rule that HUD has historically used to minimize the risk that illegal immigrants have these vouchers. By waiving this, isn't it going to increase the risk that illegal immigrants will end up obtaining these housing vouchers that are meant for U.S. citizens?
I do not believe that it will do that in any significant way, Senator. I think that to say that would assume that every single illegal resident wants to come in and scam the system. That is not how this works. People who are homeless generally do not have identification. They do not have their social security cards, etc. And so what we have done is allowed our housing authorities and partners to come up with ways to allow them to at least initially report themselves, to self-certify, and then we verify.
Okay.
And so if we find that someone is in the system that should not be, we certainly will take care of it.
Right. And so first of all, my question does not in any way imply that everyone who's here illegally is looking for these vouchers. There's no such suggestion. I'm simply saying that if there is not an opportunity to screen out people who are not actually eligible, if we don't have that mechanism, then there is likely to be some abuse of this system, and it would inevitably will take months at best to discover and then litigate and adjudicate these cases. I would just urge you to reconsider this. This is HUD's own regulation that's being waived, is described by HUD as serving the purpose of decreasing incidents of fraud, waste, and abuse. So I would just
I'm certainly
ask you
willing to do so, sir. I will take another look at it.
I appreciate that. The other thing is we've got in the administration's so-called infrastructure plan calls for $40 billion more for public housing. And, you know, in many cases, public housing has become places where people don't really want to live. There are notorious stories of concentrations of poverty and crime and other social ills. And there's research that shows that families who move out of these projects often are able to integrate themselves in communities. There's lower risk that they'll be victims of crime. It seems that there are sensible alternatives. And in fact, some of these projects are in such a state of disrepair that the cost of repairing them is greater than the cost that it would incur of just providing vouchers for people to live in good, decent homes. What are your thoughts on shifting some of this resource to providing vouchers for low-income people?
Sir, you know what, Senator? I agree with you 100%. The problem is that we have people who live in public housing now, and we do not have enough housing for the demand. And so we still have to take care of the people who are in public housing. And that's what this $40 billion will do. I mean, for many, many years, we have not invested significantly in capital needs of public housing. And so what you have is buildings that are more than 50 years old, the majority of them, that are in different stages of disrepair. And so even though I agree that we do need to find ways to move people into other housing in communities with better opportunities, we still have to deal with the issue we currently have. And that's what the $40 billion will do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I can be heard now?
Yes, you can be heard.
Okay, good. Thank you. I apologize. I don't really know what happened. Thank you, and thanks for stepping up, Pat. For too long, and I talked to both of you about this personally, and I very much appreciate your recognition of this and your interest in solving it. We failed to coordinate our housing and transportation policy. Your departments are already working together to make unprecedented investments in our communities. The question for each of you: why do we need to encourage sustainable community development with coordinated housing and transit investments? Secretary Fudge, you want to start with that, please?
I would just say that a perfect example, Senator, is in our very own community. More than a decade ago, the city of Cleveland and Cuyahoga County recognized that need. And so we right now are a community that primarily is a healthcare community. So the healthcare industry is the largest employer. So what did we do? We put transportation through the heart of our communities to get people to jobs, to get people to the hospitals, to the universities, to the research institutions. And it is clear it has been successful. So I think that we are a perfect example of why it's necessary and why it works.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg.
I think, as you noted, Secretary Fudge and I are both former mayors. I think mayors have to think about transportation and housing in an integrated way because they're part of the texture of how cities form. But maybe even more relevantly, families have to think about them in an integrated way because they hit the same family budget. And what we know is that if we can build housing on affordable terms and make it affordable to get to where you need to be, from home to work to school and anywhere else you need to go, that eases pressure on a family budget. So it's very important to think about how these can mutually reinforce one another. It's one reason we're excited in this department about transit-oriented development and other ways to link housing policies with transit and transportation policies.
Thank you. Secretary Fudge, we had this conversation when I was in your office many years ago when you were mayor of Warrensville Heights. I don't have to tell you, and we've had it since, I don't have to tell you how pervasive lead paint still is in Cleveland, how devastating the effects are. 1 in 4 children in our city entering kindergarten has had elevated blood levels, lead levels. Preventing lead poisoning not only protects kids and their futures, it also saves health and education costs and creates jobs in remediation and removal of this poison. Will you commit to work with me to make significant investments to eliminate lead paint hazards from homes in any infrastructure package that you and I and the Congress and the White House work on?
Yes, I will make that commitment because certainly we can and we must do a better job at dealing with the lead-based paint issue. Absolutely, Senator. I'd be happy to work with you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Secretary Buttigieg, on the local level, what does it mean when US DOT is able to fund a major project like bus rapid transit? Can you, as a former mayor, talk about the limits local leaders face under sort of average transportation bills that we've passed before, what more they could do with a transformative infrastructure package?
Well, certainly local leaders often have visionary plans for transportation in their communities, but with the resources that have been available, often it's taken heroic creativity just to keep things operating the way they are. And I don't think any visionary mayor or local leader wants to simply see things remain in the status quo. Often what's been needed really is a new vision, the ability to extend transit to where it hadn't been before, or as you mentioned, much more efficient means of transit than were thought of a few decades ago, like bus rapid transit. And with the right resources, the kinds of resources contemplated in the American Jobs Plan, we can meet those local leaders where they are. They've already been raising revenue, doing the work, but often these transformational investments just won't happen unless there's major federal support.
Thank you. Last question, Secretary Fudge. Over the past couple months, this committee has heard testimony from witnesses on all sides, from Richard Rothstein, that wrote The Color of Law, to Harvard's Joint Center on Housing Studies, to the American Enterprise Institute, saying that restrictive zoning can thwart access to opportunity, can hold us back as we try to address the affordable housing crisis. Madam Secretary, how can HUD help communities address restrictive zoning and expand access to housing development?
Well, I'm really happy you asked that question. The American Jobs Plan does address how we may assist communities in their zoning, because we do know that there is a lot of restrictive zoning that has created a problem, and it has made the cost of home buying and home building even more. And so what we have done is say to communities, we want to give you an incentive and assist you technically with how you look at and engage your communities to change some of the zoning laws that have created historically very difficult problems to address. We know it's a local issue, but we believe that we can give the kind of assistance that will make people rethink it and talk to them about the entire concept of moving people into communities, thriving communities that give them opportunities to be more productive citizens, to better train and school their children. We know that it's something that has to be done, and the Jobs Plan really addresses it very, very well.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Senator Warner is recognized from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And it's great to see both Secretary Fudge and Secretary Buttigieg. Secretary Fudge, I want to start a couple questions with you, kind of building on some of the conversations we've had in the past. I really appreciate the fact that while you were in Congress, you were always a strong advocate for community development financial institutions, CDFIs, a relatively small piece of our overall financing system, but as my colleagues know, by definition, they are lending to over 60% of their lending to low and moderate income communities. I'm proud of the fact that in the December bill, we made a record investment in both MDIs, minority depository institutions, and CDFIs. And while all the folks on the Democratic side were quite supportive, I want to call out my friend Mike Crapo, who was the lead Republican on that. We did get $12 billion in, $9 billion of which will go in as Tier 1 capital. Going into CDFIs, that'll basically, even on a conservative basis, add in $90 billion worth of ongoing lending capacity. When we think about the affordable housing shortages, we've got to both get at the supply, but also the ability for folks to acquire some of these units. And Secretary Fudge, can you talk about the critical role that continuing to invest in CDFIs could have as a way to address some of the housing shortages we have?
Thank you very much, Senator, and thank you for our conversations that we've had. They've been quite instructive and I think quite helpful for me as well, and I hope for you. What we noticed, and I'll tell you a perfect example, what we noticed when the House and Senate decided to do the PPP, we realized then that as we could see what was happening, that the big banks, the big institutions were getting all of the resources, and that is why people of color, small businesses, et cetera, were not getting resources because they deal with people like CDFIs and small lending institutions. And so when you start to send resources to those kind of institutions, you reach the people of highest need. That is why it is important to fund CDFIs and small community banks, because the access and the understanding culturally as well as area-wide is so much better with these institutions. So I think that they are something that we must continue to work with, because they are the people who deal with the smaller loans that help people with technical assistance and other things when it comes to home buying. They are the people who drive low-income communities. And so I think that it is an absolute necessity that we continue to fund and support CDFIs and small banks.
Well, thank you. And I do think there are a number of our community banks who want to try to do more in this space. They may need some regulatory forbearance, but I look forward to working with you and the committee on this. I also just want to make sure I get one question into Secretary Buttigieg, but I do want to raise an issue that I talked with you about, Secretary Fudge, and I've mentioned to the chairman, and I'm working with the administration on. We all know, and COVID obviously exacerbated this, the wealth gap in this country. Wealth gap between Black families, white families, 10-to-1 differential, almost as large in terms of Latino families. And a lot of that's due to the fact that Black and brown families do not have access to home ownership in similar levels. We are working on a program, Mr. Chairman, where we are looking at an initiative that would help all first-generation home buyers. So this would be not just Black and brown, be white as well, although by data it would end up being about 2/3 Black and brown communities. And I won't get into all the details here, but with a slight interest rate subsidy, we could create, through Ginnie Mae, a product that would allow a family, if they could meet a traditional mortgage payment, create literally a 20-year mortgage product that would have the payment based upon a 30-year kind of rates. Doing this, and trust me on the math at this point, I'll have to point it out to everybody, that would actually double wealth creation records. And I really look forward, in 10 years, you'd get twice as much wealth creation on a 20-year mortgage as you would on a 30-year mortgage. I'm down to 15 seconds. I just want to compliment you, Secretary Buttigieg. You met with frontline workers from WMATA and the general manager there. 40% of the federal workforce travels on Metro. We have an important federal component there. I'm sure Chris Van Hollen will ask you a question on that, but I wanted to get my 2 cents in before my time ran out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Haggerty, if he's here, is next. If not, Senator Moran. If not, Senator Cortez Masto recognized from Nevada for Senator Haggerty. I'm sorry, Catherine. Senator Haggerty is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey. Thank you. Secretary Fudge, Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for being here today. I appreciate that. I'd like to turn to my home state if I could, Tennessee. We have some of the best roads and bridges in America in Tennessee. We're also physically well-managed states. In fact, we're one of the few states that actually finance our transportation projects without using debt financing. We pay as we go on this. But I think, and Secretary Buttigieg, you're very well aware of this, that our Interstate 40 bridge that connects Tennessee and Arkansas across the Mississippi River 9 days ago, it was discovered it has a severe fracture in the structural frame, the support girders for that bridge. I've been in touch with state and local officials, with the Tennessee Department of Transportation, with barge operators in the private sector. My team has been working with the Coast Guard, who have jurisdiction over the Mississippi River. And again, the Mississippi is Middle America's superhighway for transportation and commerce. And on Saturday, I sent a letter to President Biden about the crisis and copied you, Secretary Buttigieg. And I want to thank you, because as a result of that letter, I saw that this morning that the Federal Highway Administration is sending a team to Memphis post haste. I applaud you for making this a top priority, Secretary Buttigieg. The crisis has delayed fuel supplies, it's delayed agricultural products, many critical commodities that reach markets through the Mississippi River. It's also created tremendous delays in traffic. This is affecting real people, their livelihoods, their ability to get to where they need to go. It's impacting commerce at so many levels. So I want to thank you for the effort that you put in, the responsiveness to my letter and to our conversation, Secretary Buttigieg, to prioritize this for your department. And I look forward to continuing to work with your department to make sure that the situation in Memphis and Arkansas is resolved as quickly as possible. I hope that the administration and my Democrat colleagues are serious about working in a bipartisan way to solve our infrastructure problems. The I-40 bridge that we're talking about here isn't the only problem, and this bridge shouldn't require legislation or time-consuming debate about whether government nanny care is infrastructure or not. Longer term, investment in real infrastructure, in our roads, our bridges, our tunnels, waterways, ports, rail, broadband, our power grid and pipes is needed. But to pay for it by raising taxes on American workers and job creators, just as we're poised to emerge from a pandemic-driven recession, is the opposite of what we need. We should be incentivizing hundreds of billions of dollars in private capital to get off the sidelines. And we need to be reducing bureaucratic paperwork, ridiculous regulatory costs, and unnecessary delays. And we've got to ensure that anything we do reaches all the way to the most rural areas of our country, like in my home state of Tennessee. Secretary Buttigieg, I'd like to turn my first question to you. You've had past private sector experience as a management consultant. I'm sure that you looked at ways with your clients to improve operations. I'm sure you looked at private financing too, and perhaps ways to incentivize private capital. And you have within your domain at the Department of Transportation, you have the Build America Bureau. The Build America Bureau's mission encompasses private activity bonds, the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Administration, among other programs. And as we look at infrastructure and think about infrastructure going forward, Secretary, I wanted to get your comments and thoughts on the types of process improvements, the types of bureaucratic regulatory changes that could be made that can help accelerate investment in infrastructure for us.
Well, thank you, Senator. And first of all, let me just state my appreciation for the collaboration and involvement with your office and others in dealing with the I-40 bridge matter. To get to your question, we do believe there are a lot of opportunities for us to get more bang for a taxpayer buck through process improvements, something I encountered even as a mayor, seeing all of the steps involved in permitting, and have challenged our team to identify ways that we can find where there may be duplication or there might be a way to meet the intent of the law with fewer steps or a simpler and more predictable process. I also appreciate your mentioning private activity bonds. One example, along with some of the others you mentioned, where we do see ways to mobilize private capital. And it's a popular program. Matter of fact, I think we're just about at our congressionally authorized cap right now. And while it's more appropriate to some uses than others, since, of course, many of these financing options really expect or require that there be an associated revenue stream, we do think there's a lot more potential here and would welcome opportunities to work with you on building that out, building on successes like the Build America Bureau here at the department.
I'll look forward to working on that with you and your team, Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hagerty. Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to both of our secretaries. It's good to be with you. Secretary Buttigieg, you and I have discussed the Gateway project, a series of projects, including the Port of North Bridge and the new Hudson River tunnels in a region that would modernize a 10-mile segment of track that is the linchpin of the Northeast Corridor, a region of the country that generates 20% of GDP for the entire nation. I appreciate that the President and your department have consistently highlighted the importance of Gateway, and I had the pleasure of speaking to Nuria Fernandez, the President's nominee to be the FTA administrator, about the project in her hearing last week. She committed to working with stakeholders to move the Hudson River Tunnel projects through the Capital Investment Grants Program process. And I'd like to ask for a similar commitment from you. Would you commit to working with the project sponsors and congressional delegations in the coming months to get the Gateway project done?
Well, thank you for the question. And yes, you have our commitment to work with your office, other members of the delegations, and the project sponsors on this. This is an example of a project that may be located in one region, but is so critical that you would feel it anywhere in the country if there were to be, for example, a failure in one of these critical tunnels. So we're continuing to see this move along and are committed to working with you to see it go forward.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate your appreciation of what the project means. The department has previously said that we should see the environmental reviews for the project by the end of May after years of delay by the Trump administration. Do you know if we're still on track to see that process move forward this month?
We're hopeful to see that move forward soon. And right now, I think the main area where the FTA and I think also FRA have been in touch with the project sponsors has been on the financing plan. As that information comes together, I am hopeful we can move this along as planned.
Okay. A good infrastructure plan not only creates good jobs, but also takes into account how infrastructure affects access to good jobs. Secretary Fudge, does a lack of affordable housing in job-rich areas limit workers' access to good jobs?
There's no question about it. I mean, I was just to spend some time in your state, Senator, and when we don't have people housed properly or have them in a position where they have access to housing or to good jobs or schools, yes, it is a major issue.
Thank you. The low-income communities then have the additional burden of disproportionately lacking access to transit, which could connect communities to jobs. Secretary Buttigieg, does a lack of public transit options also limit workers' access to good jobs?
Unquestionably so. People need to be able to physically get to where the opportunity is, and if they lack good or affordable options to get there, that's an economic barrier.
So therefore, wouldn't you both say that transportation access should be a major consideration when designing affordable housing policy?
Absolutely.
Yes, we think so.
I agree, and that's why I'm reintroducing the Livable Communities Act, which would create a grant program to fund coordinated development of affordable housing and transit so that we can better expand access to economic opportunities. And I look forward to hopefully working with both of you. I hope that the fact that you're both here together, which is not the normal course of events testifying, is also indicative of that both of you will be able to work together because of the nexus between transportation and housing. Madam Secretary, there's a severe nationwide shortage of affordable senior housing. According to the Urban Institute, of the 16.1 million new household formations over the next 20 years, more than 80% of them, 80% will be senior households. I know what it means to seniors in my state, which is a high-cost state. What does this significant increase in senior household mean for our senior public and assisted housing capacity and the senior housing needs that Congress should prepare for?
Senator, I'm so glad you asked that question because people, I think, forget that significant numbers of people who live in public housing are senior citizens. We know that we do not have in place the infrastructure to allow seniors over the next few years to age in place. That is one of the reasons why the jobs plan talks about how we take care of our seniors and puts resources in the 202 plan. I think that it is really important that we start to address this now as we know the senior population is going to just continue to increase. So I thank you for asking the question because it's something we must address, and we must address it.
This is where a program like our Trusted Section 202 program is really important. We look forward to working with you and with you, Mr. Secretary, for the transit side of our efforts on the development of our package. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Senator Kennedy is recognized from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. I want to thank our two secretaries for being here today. I know you're busy. Secretary Fudge.
Sir, I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you better. Yes, sir.
Okay. Secretary Fudge, Louisiana, as you probably know, was hit by two massive hurricanes last year. Focal point was Southwest Louisiana, but the hurricanes were devastating central Louisiana to northeast Louisiana. With respect to block grant disaster assistance, my governor, who happens to be a Democrat, and I, and our entire congressional delegation, have repeatedly talked to the White House about getting an answer to our request for the disaster relief. We have asked, we have begged, we have cajoled, we've sent fruit baskets. We haven't sent over a personal pan pizza yet, but we're thinking about doing that to the White House. We just want an answer. Can you help me get an answer?
Well, Senator, it's my understanding that there was an answer sent to you by OMB on behalf of the president. Is there something further that you'd like me to do? I'm happy to do it.
Yes, ma'am. Tell me what the answer was, because I haven't heard. I haven't been able to find anybody to give me an answer with the search party. I can't find them with Google. So if there's an answer, maybe you could tell me right now. I would really be grateful.
Well, but basically, I have the letter in front of me addressed to you from the acting director, Shalonda Young, who talked with you basically.
Can you tell me what it says?
Okay, yes. Basically, what it says is that certainly, and let me just say this first, though, Senator, that I'm very, very sorry about what has happened, especially even with the rains of this past week. But it says that the administration.
If the letter says yes, all is forgiven. Can you tell me if the letter says yes?
No, what the letter says, and what I'm saying as well, is that we are more than willing to support what is happening, but Congress needs to make that decision. Whatever decision Congress makes, we are going to be supportive of.
Yes, ma'am.
I stand ready.
As you know, customarily the way this works, the White House has to send a request to Congress. Has the president decided to send over that request? And if so, do you know when we'll get it?
No, but I can ask. But I would say this, Senator, just by my own time in the House, I voted for many such pieces of legislation. And all of it did not start with the White House.
Well, we do things a little differently in the Senate. I'm not saying that the House is wrong. You probably do it better than we do. But my colleagues normally will not consider anything until they know where the White House is.
Well, I will find out, sir, because I think we need to do as much as we possibly can. Okay.
Well, I thank you for that, Madam Secretary. Let me be sure I understand. You personally, on behalf of HUD, are supportive of asking Congress to give us the release. Is that right?
I personally, yes, but as you say, that's not my decision to make.
I know.
Yes, I am personally.
Have you talked to anyone at the White House about our request?
I have not, but I will make sure that I do it right away.
Okay. Can you tell me who you'll talk to?
I will talk with OMB where this started, and ultimately they are the people who are responding on behalf of the president and the White House. I will call Director Young today.
Can you tell me when we'll get an answer?
I'm going to call today. Now, I don't know when that answer will be, but as soon as I get an answer, I will make sure you get it right away.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from you is, despite the letter, the White House has not said yes, or am I mistaken?
I don't know, sir, because I've not been that involved in it. It goes between the White House and OMB, as I've said, but I will make sure that I find out the status. That I will do.
Okay. If you could, I know you, Secretary, if we could get an answer. My people deserve an answer.
I will.
And this has gone on, this has been like rope-a-dope, okay? And this has gone on, and in order for us to get it done in the Congress, we're going to have a request by the president. We all know that. And there's just been too much dodging, bobbing, and weaving. I'm a pretty simple guy. I like breakfast food, and I like straight answers. And if you could ask the White House to just give me a straight answer, or no, I would be eternally grateful. And I will send you a fruit basket.
I will ask them. A straight answer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. The next three senators are Senator Tester, then Senator Moran, and then Senator Warren. I have to duck out to do some questioning in the Ag Committee about climate. So Senator Tester's recognized for 5 minutes. If you would then just turn it to Senator Moran, who will then turn it to Senator Warren.
I will, but before you leave, Mr. Chairman, I think it's incumbent upon me to point out that Senator Moran, always being politically correct, has your book off his right shoulder. With that, I want to turn to you, Secretary Fudge. There are many challenges across the country for folks trying to access housing. It's true in Ohio, as you know, as well as in Pennsylvania. It's certainly true in Montana. It's true in our cities and towns, but it's also true in rural areas, some would call frontier areas, and on tribal lands, where oftentimes communities need more programs.
And does specifically it's done at USDA, we are very confident that with the jobs plan, we can really make a significant increase and a significant down payment, and make clear that we believe in the expansion and empowering of communities, especially rural communities.
Well, that's good. I mean, I just think it's really important because they don't have the resources, they don't have the planners, they don't have the ability to get these funds easily. And as pointed out by Senator Menendez, it's important in those communities too. Because quite frankly, there's a shortage of housing all across the country. There's significant need, but there are examples of successful existing programs that help ease the shortage when these programs are utilized. There are tax credits that can be leveraged when available, and examples of local communities enhancing their resources through public-private partnerships. So, Secretary Fudge, how can we ensure that federal resources for housing are fully utilized to get assistance to as many people and as many communities as possible?
Well, Senator, you know that for a very long time, we've only had truly, in terms of the private part, we've had the low-income housing tax credits, which have been very, very helpful. But in the jobs plan, there is another tax credit, the Neighborhood Homes Investment Tax Credit, which would also help us leverage more public resources. And then, of course, there are all of the other programs that HUD can assist with, where we have the Native American block grants and the housing block grants. I think that if you pull all of these things together, you're going to find the resources to make not only the rural communities and, of course, Native communities expand their housing options. We are able to build new housing with the resources that have been put into the jobs plan. As well, we can talk about really then starting to talk about resilient communities, which we know that we can do. But the jobs plan makes sure that all of those resources are there together with home and other programs from HUD. I think we can make it happen.
Okay. Secretary Buttigieg, I want to talk to you a little bit about the charging stations. I think it's really important we make the transition, and I think it's going to happen regardless. It could happen quicker if we're a little more aggressive. And I think the charging stations are part of it. My question to you is, and Build Back Better, how is this going to work? Is this a revolving loan fund, or is the government going to build charging stations, or are we going to give loans out to businesses who want to put charging stations at convenience stores or grocery stores or wherever it may be? Could you tell me what the vision is there?
Thank you, Senator. It's a very important question, and it's one of policy design that I think will vary based on some of the geographies that we're looking at. The economics of installing a charging station may pencil out in, for example, a luxury apartment building in the middle of a city such that no assistance is required at all. On the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of locations, especially in more spread out or rural areas, where there simply might not be a return unless there is some kind of support. So I wouldn't say that the vision is that all charging stations in the country, or even most of them, or any of them, need to be owned and operated by the federal government. This is a great opportunity for leverage and to make sure that the dollars are being put to use in a way that maximizes the availability. Of course, our support is not just in financing the establishment or the construction of the stations, but also just in siting them. And that's where we have work we can build on with the alternative fuels corridors designations that have been going on, which DOT does in partnership with the Department of Energy, just to establish where across our highway network we need to make sure there are charging stations, whether the market would provide them or not, so that range anxiety doesn't hold Americans back from adopting EVs.
Just a statement before I turn it over to Senator Moran. I really hope that when it comes to roads and bridges, infrastructure, that we continue to rely on existing formulas. If we start screwing around with that, it gets pretty dicey pretty quick. Thank you. Senator Moran?
Chairman Tester, thank you. Chairman Tester, over my right shoulder is another book that you might recognize as well. So I am now currently politically correct as I can be in this setting. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for joining us. You too, Madam Secretary. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to visit with you this morning, but I'm going to focus on the Department of Transportation. Mr. Secretary, let me raise two topics with you. COVID-19 had, as you know, a devastating impact on the airline industry, and Congress and the administration responded in a number of ways to help repair the damage that was done by lack of commercial air travel. One of the industries that was also affected by that circumstance is the manufacturing sector, of which Kansas is one of the prime places in which aviation manufacturing occurred. With the help of Senator Warner from this committee and Senator Cantwell, the chairman of the Commerce Committee, we were successful. It was successful in having passed legislation, the Aviation Manufacturing Jobs Protection Program. One of the discussions is about who should be responsible for implementing that program, and the conclusion was the U.S. Department of Transportation. So in your realm of responsibilities, you have implementation of this legislation. It's important to me. I introduced and sponsored the legislation that became an amendment to the COVID relief package. I would ask you, the department has published information on steps eligible businesses need to take prior to submitting an application. But there's not more definitive instructions than that. Your department has been kind to me. I intend to have a forum in Wichita, or at least in Kansas,
And your team has volunteered, once they know more, to be a participant in that program, trying to explain to aviation manufacturers what the program is, how it can be, how they can take advantage of it, and how we can protect our workforce in aviation. Do you have any ideas at this point about the time frame in which these funds will become eligible, and when I should be looking at scheduling and asking your staff to join me to try to explain it to a group of businesses and employees that are significantly interested?
Yes, thank you. We're moving quickly to make sure this is implemented successfully, accountably, and of course in a timely fashion. As you point out, the impact on air carriers is probably better understood in the public than the impact on manufacturers. And so this important program really will have, I think, powerful economic impact. Unlike some of the other COVID relief plans that sent dollars through existing mechanisms, this required us to stand up a new one, and we want to make sure that we get it right. I can tell you that DOT's most senior leadership is heavily engaged. We've established a senior advisory council involving every relevant part of the department to make sure that we're taking the right steps. And to your question, hope to have an application process fully defined and out for applications later on this summer, and would welcome that opportunity for DOT personnel to be there to help explain it to potential applicants.
Thank you for your obvious knowledge and awareness of this program, and presumably, seemingly is a better word, in involvement in a personal level on the part of you as the secretary. And thanks for committing your staff to helping me help explain what opportunities exist. Let me turn to a renewable energy question in regard to transit. One of the things that I think has happened is that with the programs, public transit programs, that are attempting to accelerate the transition of our bus fleets from diesel and gasoline to cleaner energy alternatives, it seems that to me that these programs have overwhelmingly favored certain renewable fuels. And by that, I think those words mean electric, to the diminution of other cleaner fuels, such as renewable natural gas or natural gas. And as a result, those bus programs that those renewable fuels, particularly renewable natural gas, make a lot of sense. I don't think they're going through the process to seek the funds because of what I think is maybe perhaps a perceived or perhaps a real bias or prejudice one way or the other. I would ask that you take a look at being more balanced in that view. There are buses, and I think I'm particularly probably talking about rural communities in which renewable natural gas is a viable and valuable and environmentally sound alternative to electric vehicles. I would ask you to enable the transit agencies to pursue the cleanest available vehicles that suit the needs of the fleet and the public transit infrastructure. It is better to get us in a position using renewable natural gas or natural gas to reduce emissions than those buses continuing in their current state without the federal support because they are not converting to electric. And there are some issues with electric, as Senator Tester was saying, about the charging stations, also where the important elements that make up batteries come from are outside the United States. So there's some issues with this. I'm just looking for you to commit that there is a place that the Department of Transportation should recognize for renewable natural gas and natural gas.
Well, thank you. We certainly recognize a role for natural gas vehicles that are producing fewer emissions than, for example, a diesel vehicle. Part of the issue, of course, is that in a program that is designed to minimize emissions, a vehicle with zero tailpipe emissions will typically be more competitive. But as you note, sometimes what's right in one region may be different from another, or there may be different resources available to different transit authorities. And we'll continue to try to tailor what we're doing so that it makes sense on the ground.
I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, as you know, what's valuable and practical in your largest city in Indiana or my largest city in Kansas may not be the most practical or valuable solution in a rural community of several hundred or several thousand people. And we sometimes think of transit as being the large city's way of moving people. But as you know, in our states, it affects lots of seniors and disabled individuals and getting to the doctor and getting to the grocery store in ways that are different than what a city mass transit program would look like.
Absolutely agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Warren is recognized from Massachusetts for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Fudge, we've discussed the importance of addressing our nation's affordable housing crisis head on. And I know that you are committed to increasing the number of affordable units available to families. But those homes have to be built somewhere. And too many communities around the country, restrictive zoning laws that were born out of racial segregation prevent new affordable housing units from being built. Using exclusionary zoning to keep families, often lower income families and families of color, out of certain neighborhoods is wrong. And over time, the harm really adds up. Exclusionary practices drive up the cost of housing for everyone and reduce the amount of available land. So, Secretary Fudge, at your confirmation hearing, you told this committee that it is important that we get rid of the notion of not in my backyard. How does that not in my backyard approach impede efforts to address the affordable housing crisis?
Well, first off, thank you, Senator, for our ongoing conversations about this. The first thing that it does is it increases the cost of housing and it limits where we can build housing. If you have restrictive zoning ordinances, then there are two things that happen or can happen. One is that where there is available land, you cannot build, or the zoning is so onerous that it costs you more money to build. Maybe they put all kinds of restrictions on it that increase the cost of buying the property. The other thing it does is it just basically says to people in our communities, we do not want you to live in our neighborhood if you are low income, if you are a person of color. And so what we have found is that these laws have been around so very long that the jobs plan now gives us the opportunity to go into communities with some incentives to assist them in how we discuss it, how we can give them the kind of technical assistance to change it, how we engage communities so that we can have a better narrative about why we should allow new housing and housing that is not restrictive in communities that historically have prevented us from building.
Right. So let me follow up on that. How would incentives help? Aren't these changes that the federal government can just make on its own to get this housing built? Or why do you need these incentives?
Well, they really can't. A lot of the zoning laws are really just local. They're local ordinances, many of which we cannot change as a federal government. Now, we can talk about discrimination overall. We can talk about civil rights overall, but we cannot just go into a community and change all of their zoning or planning ordinances. And that is why we want to engage communities with conversation, with technical assistance, to talk to them about how they can change them, how they can, maybe we can come to some agreement that makes them not as restrictive and not as costly.
Well, I completely agree with the direction you're going here. My American Housing and Economic Mobility Act includes a new $10 billion housing innovation grant program that would provide funding so that local governments can use it to build things like parks or schools if they are actively removing unnecessary barriers to building affordable units in their communities. Eligible reforms would include things like changing bans on multifamily construction, revising minimum lot size requirements, or passing inclusionary zoning ordinances. So let me ask, Secretary Fudge, could this kind of grant program make a difference in pushing communities to expand the supply of affordable housing?
There's no question but that it can be helpful.
Good.
And it's certainly something that I'd like to really get into some more detail with you about, because until we can get to that point that we can include the kinds of things you're talking about, we're going to forever have people locked out of communities of opportunity, given the opportunity to go to better schools, to have better jobs, and to build wealth. So I would very much like us to continue that conversation.
Oh, and I very much want to work with you on this. You know, I was so glad to see President Biden call for the elimination of exclusionary zoning and to end harmful land use policies as part of his American Jobs Plan. And now I got a proposal ready to go on this. Taking on our affordable housing crisis requires a comprehensive strategy, and reducing exclusionary zoning and land use restrictions has to be a part of this. So Thank you, Secretary Fudge, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Cortez Masto is recognized for 5 minutes from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And thank you to both Secretaries Buttigieg and Fudge for this great conversation, the good work that you were doing. Let me start off with Secretary Buttigieg. I had the pleasure of speaking with Acting Administrator Fernandez at her nomination hearing about the ability for capital investment grant project sponsors, specifically in my state, the Regional Transportation Commission in Washoe County, to be able to utilize its project cost savings, further enhancing their specific project corridors. I'm going to include, for the record, a question on whether the department will reward project sponsors who are good stewards of taxpayer dollars that come in on time and under budget with the ability to repurpose those funds to other important elements of an existing federally funded project within their community. So I'm going to submit that for the record. I do want to talk to you about smart communities. I know that President Biden included a call for building on really an Obama-era Smart Cities Challenge program with $1 billion annually in his infrastructure proposal. Can you talk to me about why this is important? Why are smart communities important? Why this proposal?
Thank you. Well, let me mention both the structure of the program and the substance of the program. I was a mayor when the Smart Cities Challenge came out and saw the impact it had even on cities like mine that weren't even participating in the competition. It stimulated a race to the top and encouraged local communities to do what they do best, which is innovate. And so that kind of structure with an emphasis on sharing ideas and an emphasis on working directly with local communities, we think was very powerful and something we can build on. In terms of the substance of the vision, it's really about making sure that we future-proof our investments and are taking advantage of the extraordinary change that is coming to transportation and certainly will be across the 2020s. That change could be enormously empowering and beneficial on everything from climate to equity to job creation, but it won't be that way on its own. It's why we have to have a lot of intention and good policies behind it, and of course resources, which is why you see it reflected in the president's vision.
Well, thank you, and I couldn't agree more. And I do agree that the incentive isn't so important, and that's why when I first got here to the Senate, I introduced the Moving First Act to bring back and expand the Obama-era Smart Cities Challenge. I think it is so important that this incentive is out there. We've seen the benefits of it and the opportunities we have to embrace this advanced technology for our communities. I will tell you, my bill is endorsed by the League of Cities, NACO, the Chamber of Commerce's Tech Division, and APTA and the American Society of Civil Engineers. So I look forward to working with the administration. I think this is a great opportunity here for our communities. But let's talk about the communities, and I only have so much time. Secretary Fudge, I couldn't agree more. You both know this better than anyone. Everything that we are working on, particularly the nexus between affordable housing, transit, and employment centers, starts at the local level with zoning, right? That's the key to all of this. And that's why at the federal level, we may incentivize, we may try to get dollars and resources out there, but it really starts with that initial planning, urban planning or rural planning and the zoning. And that's why it was important for me to introduce the Better Plan Act. Now, I absolutely support what Senator Menendez is doing with his legislation on livable communities. The Better Plan Act that I've introduced is really compatible with what we're trying to do here, which is enhancing that coordination between metropolitan planning organizations, local land use agencies, and housing stakeholders to align transportation plans with our local housing goals, as well as ensuring that we're connecting them with those important employment centers. So Secretary Fudge, can you talk just a little bit about that nexus and why it is so important and why we have to engage local communities in this if we are really going to get it right?
Well, first off, let me just thank you for your continued focus on affordable housing. In our conversations, I've been so very pleased to know of all of the things that you are working on that I believe are going to be helpful. But as you talk about, and your state probably is the perfect example, if we cannot get people to jobs because they live in communities that are so isolated and or so difficult to move people from good jobs to home, then it is a problem, whether it be a teacher, a firefighter, or anybody else. I think that we have to make sure that we understand that both of them are really infrastructure. But when you talk about building roads and bridges, you have to connect them to something. So let's not why can we not connect them to in the way that is beneficial to the people we represent, all of us. I represent people who need housing, who need public housing, low-income people. They have to rely on us to make sure that we plan appropriately, work together to make sure that what we are doing is going to be beneficial to them in the long run. And that means we have to have transportation that is smart, transportation that is accessible to where people live and work.
That's right. And let me add, and I know my time is up, but one other thing, where they live and work, but in my state, they're working 24 hours, right? So the transit, that connectivity, that opportunity has to be available to everyone at all times, particularly if they're working a graveyard shift, right? Or a late shift or a day shift, whatever that may be. It is so important that we bring that nexus together for everybody and meet their needs where they are. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. Let's start with Secretary Buttigieg. As you know, a number of my constituents in South Carolina were affected by the hack of the Colonial Pipeline earlier this month. The estimate is about 40% of the gas stations in South Carolina were without gas because of that hack. That means that real people and their lives are strained by the lack of access to the gas. I know that talking to some of my constituents in Spartanburg and in Greenville, they were waiting an hour in the line to try to figure out how to get gas in their cars to take their kids to school or go to the grocery store. You called the Colonial Pipeline hack a wake-up call for the country's cybersecurity vulnerability. I actually agree with that statement wholeheartedly. I think there's another wake-up call that we are seeing as well, and I believe Secretary Jennifer Granholm said it best last week when she admitted that pipelines are the best way to transport fuel. That has to be a wake-up call for the administration that did not continue with the construction of the XL pipeline within the first few weeks of the administration. As Secretary of Transportation, do you agree with Secretary of Energy when she says that pipelines are the best way to transport fuel?
Well, of course, it depends on the context. Nobody's proposing that we establish a pipeline that goes directly to every gas station or every community in the country. Let me
give you more context then. Do you think that the important comments by the Secretary of Energy as it relates to transporting fuel through a pipeline is important enough for us to revisit the XL pipeline project, or does that statement not include the XL pipeline from your perspective?
Yeah, in my view, it does not support any change to the administration's view on the XL pipeline. It's certainly the case that over certain long distances in certain contexts, it makes sense to have pipelines. After all, one thing our department's very proud of is the work that we do through the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to make sure that 2+ million miles of pipeline in the U.S. are safe. At the same time, the president is keeping his commitment that he made during the campaign to guide any decisions about pipelines or our energy policy more generally based on climate responsibility, as well as what makes sense for our economy in the long term.
So thank you for that answer. I will say that according to many experts that I've read, the actual XL pipeline, stopping that project means you're going to carry that energy over the roads, over the rail, which actually increases our carbon footprint, not decreases our carbon footprint. So by not having the pipeline, we're actually doing more harm to the environment and not less harm. So that is a confusing position, but I'm glad to see that there's an inconsistency between the two secretaries. Let me move to HUD and ask a question of my friend Secretary Fudge as it relates to manufacturing housing. As you may recall, back in 2019, we passed a bipartisan legislation that allowed for more manufacturing housing to be a part of the strategy that we use to help home ownership become more affordable for people throughout the country. When would you expect HUD to issue guidance for the inclusion of manufacturing housing in states and local governments' consolidated plans?
First off, thank you. It's good to see you, Senator, and I thank you and appreciate your concern about manufactured housing. You know that we do have some guidelines, and certainly the guidelines that were requested in 2019, I think probably got caught up in all of the things that were going along with COVID, but we believe that we will have something by the end of this year. We know we're a little bit behind, but as I said, in 2019, I think COVID and trying to get CARES Act funding and other things out may have delayed it, but we are working on it as we speak, sir.
As you would imagine, that my state has a disproportionate share of the manufacturing housing, and we experience lots of natural disasters. And I will say that the current state of manufacturing housing has transformed positively, where you have a stronger home, you have a more resilient home than ever imagined. And so whatever we can do to hit the accelerator on that, I believe will be helpful to those folks who are on the margin, on the bubble, so to speak. They could be a homeowner or they could not be a homeowner, depending on how accessible manufacturing housing is. So thank you very much for your commitment to move that
pleasure,
forward.
because I'm a strong proponent as well, Senator. So we'll get right on it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Fudge, thank you for your leadership, and I'm pleased to see the American Jobs Plan include major provisions to increase the overall supply of housing and affordable housing, and use federal incentives to address discriminatory local zoning practices. I was also pleased to see a reference there to the importance of continuing with affordable housing vouchers. Senator Young and I have introduced a bipartisan bill calling for the creation of 500,000 family stability and opportunity vouchers. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities has indicated that any plan to address affordable housing for the lowest income households has to include an expansion of the voucher program. And this is designed to provide wraparound services to families, and has been a proven way of helping lift people out of poverty. I've mentioned this to you before. We're going to introduce it again soon. What I want to ask today is just a commitment from you to get back to me and to Senator Young as to whether or not the Biden administration will fully endorse this proposal. That's my request today.
The answer is yes. I will get back to you. Happy to do it, sir.
Thank you. And, you know, speaking of discrimination, one of the most insidious forms of discrimination is landlords denying families, rent based on source of income. And we've got to address that, I believe, in this legislation. Nobody should be denied access to housing because they're relying on an affordable housing voucher. Secretary Buttigieg, I applaud the inclusion of the $20 billion in the American Jobs Plan to help reconnect communities that had been split by prior federal infrastructure investments. We've talked about this before. I was just in Baltimore City with the mayor this week at the site of what we call the Highway to Nowhere, 1.5 miles of highway that was stopped because people in the better off part of town succeeded in stopping it, but not before 1.5 miles of highway were built that split an African-American community and neighborhoods. We've got to heal these wounds, bring the community together. It's a perfect example of why those funds need to be used. I want to ask you now about the transportation funding formula for a second. Because if a state like the state of Maryland wants to build a highway, we just use our federal formula funds and we go ahead. We get 80% federal funding. We want to invest in a transit line, a new start. We need to apply for a grant. We need to get approval from the FTA. And then at most, we get 60% federal match. And currently, there's no new start with a full funding grant agreement of more than 50% federal funds. So clearly, if you're a state and you want your dollars to travel faster, the federal government is now incentivizing highways over transit. Can you agree that we should change this and commit to work on changing this as part of the American Jobs Plan?
Well, one thing I would point to is that the once in a lifetime investments that are contained in the American Jobs Plan roll out on a different basis. You saw the president's vision include $85 billion for public transit and transit related investments. Not that we don't care about highways, roads, and bridges. Indeed, there's over $100 billion committed to that purpose. But we're trying to base it off where the needs actually are, and that's why you'll see that different ratio encapsulated in the president's vision for that major investment we need to make for the future.
Got it. Well, I want to work with you on what the cost share is for the states, because right now in our ongoing programs, there's a huge incentive to go for a highway investment rather than a transit investment. And that discourages states from using their dollars for transit, even when that makes the most sense, because the federal dollar travels faster on the highway than on transit. Briefly, I know you agree that building federal roads, bridges, or other infrastructure, we should do it in a way that's built to last. And if it's in a federal floodplain or other area that will be impacted by climate change, we need to build with resilience. The Obama administration put in place the Federal Risk Management Standard. The GAO has said that that's a good way to save taxpayer dollars. The Trump administration tanked it. President Biden indicated that he was going to reinstate this really in the first week, but that has not happened. Can you speak to this and just commit to moving forward on this common sense proposal?
With regard to that standard specifically, I'll look into that and see if we can get more information on where it stands. More generally, to your point, this is why resilience is such a focus of the jobs plan. I think there's a common sense case to be made that if, let's say a road washes out and climate change effects suggest it'll wash out again next year if we put it back just the way it was, shouldn't our policy be able to tell the difference? And that's certainly part of what we mean when we say build back better.
No, I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. This is one thing you could do today that would help change that going forward before we even have to enact legislation. So I really encourage you to do that, and hope you can get back to me on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Tillis from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Fudge, and Secretary Buttigieg. Congratulations on your confirmations, and thank you for being with us today. Secretary Buttigieg, I want to thank you for reaching out to me, the courtesy call before you went down to North Carolina. And I want to ask you a general question of maybe what you're hearing as you travel across the country. But when you were down in North Carolina, what takeaways were there in terms of the needs and priorities down in the state?
Well, one of the things I saw was just how rightly proud North Carolinians are about some of the visionary work that's been done to support and expand options in communities that are growing. With growth comes a lot of challenges, and they're good challenges to have, but still require forward-looking transportation policy. I also had a chance to see some of the extraordinary research that is going on. Some of it's supported with federal and state transportation dollars, things that I could go on about for hours, but I promise not to, in terms of, for example, optimizing pavement, which might not seem like a sizzling topic of great interest, but just a little difference in making a piece of pavement last longer in harsh weather could mean enormous savings for communities in the federal government. So it was a very instructive trip, and I look forward to continuing to be in touch on the progress that's being made there.
Thank you. I'm kind of curious. I'm speaking with legislative leaders and the governor. One of the topics that's come up in North Carolina, I'm curious if it's something that we're hearing across the country, is that with the billions of dollars that are down in the states and they're looking at flexibility, ways to use it. Have you heard much in the way of trying to use some of the relief funds that right now are restricted from transportation projects to potentially, I think California has about a $70 billion surplus, for example, and looking at maybe repurposing some of that for infrastructure projects?
So I think every state and local government that's gotten support is assessing how best to put it to use. I do want to emphasize that of course, we want to make sure there's the right kind of flexibility for those dollars to be well spent, but would also flag the risk of spending the same dollar twice, so to speak, in terms of imagining that a dollar is unspent simply because it takes longer to get committed. To give you an example, you can imagine a transit authority that sees that their ridership went down 90% or 80% in 2020. Now they see it maybe back at 50%, might still be down 30% next year. And so you won't see some of those dollars that are designed to keep them afloat obligated until next year, maybe later because of the reimbursement pattern. But that was part of the congressional intent. And so I just want to note that there was a multi-year vision for some of how these dollars would move.
Just maybe back as a baseline question, we've got various views around Washington now about what defines infrastructure. In your role as secretary, how do you define infrastructure?
Well, I view infrastructure as the foundation that makes it possible for Americans to live a life of their choosing. That can include the transportation infrastructure that makes it possible for you to get to work or school. It could include the internet infrastructure that makes it possible for you to communicate with work or school, whether you're physically moving around or not. We in the administration, of course, also believe that tearing down a barrier in the form of, let's say, unaffordable elder care or child care amounts to part of the care infrastructure that helps America work. I recognize and respect their different views about how we define these things. My hope is that even if we agree to disagree on a philosophical question about what to call something, that we have a good chance to agree on good policies that will make a difference for the American people.
Yeah, I would just on that note, I agree with the first part of your assessment of infrastructure, which I think has traditionally been defined that way, along with broadband, which I think the modern definition absolutely should include it. It's not that I'm necessarily opposed to some of the other initiatives that we're casting a wider net and calling infrastructure, but I think that most of the American people, when they think about infrastructure, they think about the things that are in your lane and the Department of Transportation, and would like to have a separate discussion about the efficacy, the affordability, and the long-term viability of those other programs. Just really quickly, and this is for Secretary Fudge and Secretary Buttigieg, I feel like Davis-Bacon, many say is an artifact from the Jim Crow era that was preventing minorities to get into construction work. Now we're using it maybe a little bit differently. The concern that I have is if we're going to impose these higher labor costs on infrastructure projects, on affordable housing projects, aren't we really discounting the impact that we can have with the use of the federal taxpayers' money? And Secretary Fudge, we can go to you first.
No, I really don't think that we are, and that's why we're putting in place things that the jobs plan will help us to bridge the gap for affordable housing, what it costs to build it, what people can pay for it. If you look at the jobs plan in its totality, you will see that these issues have actually been addressed within the bill.
Well, I've just seen the cost of labor in these construction projects can nearly double the cost of labor. So I'm having a hard time getting my head around how that is consistent with trying to produce more access to affordable housing. But my time has expired. We'll take this up off the committee. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. The senator from Minnesota, Senator Smith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Brown, and welcome, Secretary Fudge and Secretary Buttigieg. It's great to be with you virtually. I'm going to try to get to two questions if I can for both of you. And the first question has to do with this. As we get ready, I hope, to be making bold and transformational investments in infrastructure, we need to focus on how to make sure that the benefits of those investments and the jobs that they create are broadly shared. And I think that we can all acknowledge that in the past, communities of color and low-income communities have often not seen the jobs that were created by federal and state infrastructure investments. And we've seen this story unfold over and over again in roads and bridge construction, but also in public housing construction and maintenance too. So I think now in this moment, we have an opportunity to change this, but it is going to take a clear strategy and intention. So that's what my question is for you. How do you intend to work on this issue in your agencies so that we can make sure that communities of color and low-income communities are benefiting from the job opportunities that are created by these significant infrastructure investments? And maybe I'll start with Secretary Buttigieg.
Well, thank you. We share this priority. We think it's very important, both in terms of the communities that benefit from the overall asset that might be added in the form of a transit line or a bridge or road or whatever it may be, but also those who get to participate in the business opportunities that are created, the ownership of the businesses, and certainly the workers. Yesterday with Secretary Walsh, Mayor Bowser here in Washington, and others, we visited the work site of the Frederick Douglass Bridge, which takes South Capitol across the river to Anacostia. And they had very effectively used local hire and project labor agreements to make sure that the local community, the diverse local community, was reflected on the worksite. I think continuing to partner with local agencies and authorities, with labor organizations, and everybody else who has a stake in this really needs to remain a priority so that we create the most opportunity we can for including or especially for those who've been excluded in the past.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. And Secretary Fudge, you and I have talked about this before. What opportunities do we have for creating jobs for people living in public housing or in poor communities as I dearly hope, making significant investments in housing in those communities?
Thank you very much. And we've talked about it. I think there are a number of things that the jobs plan really can do. Apprenticeship program so that we can prepare people for some of these construction jobs. We know there are going to be more than 100,000 of them. We can talk about doing things like making sure that certain contracts and certain employees come from certain geographic areas. We can create goals for contracts. There are many things we can do and should do, and the jobs plan is going to allow us the opportunity to do just those things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really look forward to working with both of you on this. I think this is extremely important. Secretary Buttigieg, I want to come back to you on a question about how the American Jobs Plan proposal to include a $20 billion grant program to help reconnect communities that have been split apart by the creation of federal highways. So just give me a minute to tell you about the story of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. Rondo was a lively community with hundreds of prospering Black businesses and family homes. 80% of St. Paul's African-American population lived in Rondo, including a strong and flourishing middle class. And then in the late 1950s and 1960s, you know the story, construction of the I-94 interstate literally ripped this community in half. 700 homes owned by Black families were destroyed, 300 businesses gone forever. And the destruction of these homes and businesses had a devastating impact on this community. $157 million in home equity loss. That's equity that never was able to be passed on and has clearly contributed to the intergenerational wealth gap that we see so significantly in Rondo, in Minnesota, and in the whole country. But here's the good news. The amazing community group called Reconnect Rondo has a vision for how to build a land bridge over the I-94 freeway and create an African-American arts and enterprise and culture and living community. So could you, in the few seconds that I have left, talk to us a little bit about how that vision for Reconnect Rondo fits with what your vision is for that $20 billion grant program?
Well, thank you. Very briefly, this is certainly an example of what we've been talking about in terms of how federal dollars often serve to segregate, divide, or destroy neighborhoods of color. And as your example illustrates, this is not something that was confined to one region of the country. It happened in so many different places. So now the question is, how can we right that wrong? Sometimes that in some geographies, that's meant removing, replacing, or submerging a highway. In others, it means working around it. And that's, I think, an elegant quality of the proposal you're describing. And these are the kinds of initiatives that we want to support with federal dollars in visions like the American Jobs Plan. Again, largely because we know in a previous generation, it was federal dollars sometimes that created the problem to begin with.
Thank you, Secretary. That was no accident, of course, that's where the route for I-94 freeway was chosen. And I think there's an opportunity to restore that community. And I would welcome you coming to Minnesota to see their vision and to imagine with us what we could do there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Kramer of North Dakota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having this important hearing, and to the two administration officials, thanks for being here. Mr. Secretary, thanks for the nice conversation yesterday. And as you know, I sit both on this committee and the Environment and Public Works Committee, both of which have some jurisdiction over the main titles in the Surface Transportation Authorization Bill. And last month, we held a hearing in EPW on the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. And it was pointed out then during the hearing that the fund would be nearly solvent if transit programs were actually appropriated rather than being included in the Highway Trust Fund distribution. Now, I appreciate the point, and I assume there's not an appetite in Congress right now to strip transit from the Highway Trust Fund, but traditionally, Congress has always kept an 80-20 split between highway and transit programs respectively. And so as we work towards this reauthorization, maybe give me your perspective or just ask straight up, do you agree that we should keep the 80-20 split in between the highways and transit?
Well, I certainly recognize the role that that split in the formula has traditionally played. I would say the jobs plan thinks beyond the year-to-year funding that we're accustomed to, because we know that a different ratio may characterize the once-in-a-lifetime transformational investments that we think we need to make as a country. So I think even though legislatively those two things may come to be joined together potentially, depending on how things proceed, I would say conceptually we're really talking about two different things. Of course, I think most of the communities we speak to are perhaps less concerned with the some of the technicalities than they are with making sure that these priorities are funded. And I know that that's certainly important in rural areas that have a lot on the line in terms of whether we continue to support critical connections, whether we're talking about roads and highway, transit, or other means of getting around. And want to echo what some of your colleagues have mentioned, that transit, I think in the public imagination, sometimes is conceived of as strictly a big city phenomenon. But of course, it's often in small communities that can make a big difference as well.
It is, but again, underfunding highways to this other issue, it has obviously a detriment as well. So the bottom line is we need enough money, obviously, to do all the things we want to do. In the meantime, I'd like to hang on to at least as much of the formula as we can, if not all of it. I'm going to switch for just a second. Madam Secretary, Secretary Fudge, great to see you again, by the way. I look forward to working with you some more. As you know, access to affordable housing obviously is a challenge for a lot of Americans, including those in rural America. So both highways and housing have a lot in common. The Housing Choice Voucher program at HUD, it helps about little over 5 million low-income people afford safe housing and decent housing in the private market. And it's administered, of course, by local public housing agencies, PHAs, as you know, and families that receive a voucher have 60 days to find a unit. They then pay 30% of household income toward rent and utilities, while the PHA pays the landlord the remaining rent. And HCVs increase, of course, stability, they reduce homelessness, and each year lift more than 1 million people out of poverty. As HUD acknowledges in its 2019 Evidence Matters report, landlord participation in the program determines the number of available units. It's pretty obvious, right? And their geographic distribution, of course, which in turn affects tenant mobility and healthy housing, fair housing. Unfortunately, there are things like rent payment standards, administrative processes, and misrepresentations of the program that can cause uncertainty in the operations and deter owners from participating in the program. In fact, we know that landlord participation is declining, with an average of 10,000 housing providers having left the program each year between 2010 and 2016. So as part of it, just more of an announcement, as part of improving the voucher holders' access, today Senator Coons and I introduced a bill to increase resources and reduce the programmatic barriers in the HCV program that will help hopefully attract and retain landlords. It's called the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. Provides $500 million to create what we call the Herschel Laskowitz Housing Partnership Fund, which is named after a longtime state senator and mayor of Fargo, who was a strong advocate for affordable housing. And just quickly, it would offer a signing bonus to landlord with a unit in low poverty areas, provide security deposit assistance so that the tenants can better afford to meet the required deposits, provide a financial bonus, increase funding to the Tribal HUD VASH program, and use some neighborhood specific data and reduce inspection delays. And I just say all that as my time runs out, Secretary Fudge, just to tell you that I'm looking forward to spending more time with you to talk about the specifics as we roll it out.
Look forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Sinema is recognized for 5 minutes from Arizona.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Secretary Fudge, it's wonderful to see you again. You know, we have a lot of work to do to expand opportunities for first-time homebuyers and ensure that there's sufficient affordable housing available to Arizonans. The state of the housing market in Arizona is particularly challenging right now. It's a very hot market. And I hear from my friends and neighbors that a home will go on the market in Phoenix and receive dozens of offers within 48 hours. Many of these offers exceed the traditional 20% down payment. Some offers are entirely in cash, and that shows the highly competitive nature of the market. I've even heard of homes that are selling for 20 or 30% over the list price, paid entirely in cash. So Arizonans who are looking to buy their first home are feeling very frustrated, and it's becoming too expensive to buy a home in Arizona. This has real implications for Arizona families. Delaying home ownership makes it harder for families to build long-term wealth, and it can force changes to other major life events like taking a new job or getting married or starting a family. So what types of solutions do you think could alleviate some of the housing supply challenges that we're seeing in Arizona?
Thank you very much, Senator, for the question. And just know that I appreciate our conversations as well during my confirmation, et cetera. Let me say there are a couple of things that the jobs plan is going to do to make this much better. We know that the biggest problem is that there is just not enough supply of affordable and low-income housing. It just doesn't exist. And so one of the things that the jobs plan is going to do is create as many as 2 million new houses or housing units. In addition to, with some of the tax credits, we think we could add another 500,000 houses or units of housing. We also are talking about how we deal with assisting home buyers, whether it be home buyer assistance, technical assistance, down payment assistance. We are working on all of those issues because we know that there are so many impediments to purchasing housing, but the biggest issue really is a supply issue. And so that's the biggest thing that we're working on, and that is a part of the jobs bill.
Thank you, Secretary. I know that some of these shortages and price issues are also due to global supply chain issues, particularly lumber shortages that are contributing to rising construction costs. So my next question relates to manufactured housing. So whether we're talking about traditional manufactured housing or the growth of tiny homes, it's clear that these products are going to play an important role in satisfying consumer demand and providing affordable choices. So what role do you believe that manufactured housing plays in addressing ongoing housing supply challenges? And how can we work collaboratively to provide more safe, high quality, affordable choices to prospective homeowners?
I had an opportunity just on last week to have a meeting with the home builders, and they have talked about the fact that lumber alone has gone up more than 200% since COVID began. We know that the cost of trying to build a single family house today, based upon lumber costs, et cetera, has gone up more than $32,000. So the things that we are trying to do with resources like low-income housing tax credits, like home that can assist with bridging the gap between the cost of housing and making it more affordable for people to purchase. We have put in place a new tax credit as well. So those are things that have been considered within the jobs package. And I just do say to you that manufacturing homes is an option that we too seldom look at. It is affordable, it is resilient, it is energy efficient, and it is something that we should do more and more of, because I think that it is quick to make sure that we can put in place. So it's fast to put in place, and it's just a good option, as are tiny homes and others. But I think the real issue becomes, how do we make whatever the product is more affordable by the use of private investments, especially by way of tax credits?
I agree. Before my time expires, I just want to ask you a final question about homelessness. We continue to see a larger number of individuals experiencing homelessness due to the economic damage from the pandemic. It's concerning, and we must ensure that our communities have the resources to provide safe, stable housing and other vital wraparound services that can help folks get back on their feet. So I wanted to raise with you that we are seeing a growing number of seniors experiencing homelessness in Arizona. And we've seen this trend on the rise for the past few years. Now, it's a challenging crisis and there are no easy answers. But I'd like to ask that our teams work together to identify some solutions to address senior homelessness and, of course, work to earn bipartisan support.
To work with you. We have a lot of options that we can look at. Certainly, of course, Congress just did give us resources for emergency vouchers. So I'd be happy to work with your team.
Thank you so much, Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Fudge, on the matter of housing insecurity, you told the White House press pool on March 18th, quote, "I don't know where my Republican colleagues live, but they don't think that there isn't a problem, but there is." With all due respect, contrary to your assertion that Republicans are out of touch with the difficulties of housing insecure Americans, whether urban or rural, we do understand. In fact, according to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, home prices rose about 11% between the fourth quarter of 19 and 20 nationwide. And let me tell you, where I live, in Montana, annual price appreciation was 15.5%, the second fastest in the nation. In fact, in my hometown of Bozeman, it's gotten to the point now where housing is not affordable. Median price is now around $700,000. Low-income families, seniors struggling to get by, young families just starting out, municipal workers that form the backbone of our communities, they can't catch a break. And turning back to a point some of my colleagues have already raised, what concerns me is the fact that your agency intends to provide assistance to illegal immigrants at the same time American citizens are homeless. Considering that taxpayer dollars are a finite resource, should we really be extending housing assistance to persons who entered our country unlawfully when there are hundreds of thousands of homeless Americans, to say nothing of some 40,000 homeless veterans, people who are willing to die for our freedoms and our country?
Again, I would say that we have no intention of violating the current law. I've said it, I mean it. What you are talking about is waiving the document requirement, which will not, in fact, make it easier for people, because we know that families who are ineligible eventually are going to be removed from the system. But we do need to give our agencies the ability to conduct determinations as to whether these people do qualify, because initially we don't know if they qualify or not. But our goal is to make sure that people are not sleeping on the street. And so we know that we are going to be able to meet your requirements and the requirements of the law. I'm not at all concerned about the fact that the waiver is going to increase the number of illegal or undocumented people in this country.
Well, thanks, Secretary Fudge. I know we agree that sheltering the homeless is critical. And as a former member of Congress yourself, I know you'll agree that taxpayer funds should be spent on citizens, and our first priority
Absolutely.
has to be our constituents. Shifting gears, we've witnessed record prices for wood products and other construction materials this spring, which has played a role in increases in the cost of housing, big increases. It's going to take some time for the supply chains to recover, but until then, construction costs are going to remain exorbitant. You've mentioned that one of the president's priorities is the construction of new affordable housing units. Secretary Fudge, how will HUD address increased cost of timber, plywood, and other critical building materials?
Well, that's a tough one, certainly, because, unfortunately, HUD doesn't have the ability to determine what the market will get for lumber. But what we can do is to make that housing more affordable by some of the things that are in the jobs plan. We can assist with bridging the gap between what makes a payment affordable and not affordable. We can assist with, again, as I said, looking at down payment, first-time home buyer, looking at how we use tax credits. There are many things we can do to assist, but we really do not have the ability to determine what the cost is really going to be, because the market drives a lot of that. And it's just something that's not within our purview to do.
One of the real challenges, and thank you, Secretary Fudge, has been inflation. We're already beginning to see the effects of inflation. It diminishes the spending power, certainly, of so many working Americans. And it's a result of some of the ill-advised, this very partisan stimulus package, another massive spending package before we even reach appropriation season will only serve to accelerate inflation and make the cost of housing more unaffordable for lower income families at a time when we need their help. I want to shift gears now and talk about permitting reform for Secretary Buttigieg. There's significant infrastructure needs in my state.
About 10 seconds. Sorry.
What's that?
Nothing, sorry.
There's significant infrastructure needs in my state throughout the country. We've got broad support, bipartisan, for funding real infrastructure like roads, bridges, and ports, et cetera. I'm going to cut to the chase as I'm out of time. Secretary Buttigieg, how's the administration plan to address the issue of how long it takes to go through the permitting process? It can take up to 5 years. It's a real problem. We can get the funds to put the infrastructure in, but then we're caught up in 5 years of red tape. How's the administration plan to address this? Can you commit to work with Congress to significantly reduce permitting times to get these projects to the point where we're starting to dig?
I would welcome opportunities to work with Congress on this. Of course, I don't mean anything that would be cutting corners in terms of safety or environmental expectations, but where we see a process taking longer than it has to, or duplication in permitting, or an opportunity for our department to be more user-friendly, helping to move these processes along, we would welcome that so that we minimize the length of time and the expense of any project funded with federal dollars.
All right. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Buttigieg, there has been already early stage planning for passenger rail linking Atlanta and Charlotte with a possible stop in the Athens area. There's also advanced discussion of rail connections between Atlanta and Savannah with a possible connection in the Macon area. The South is often left out of intercity passenger rail discussions. Will you please commit to working with my office to ascertain what can be accomplished through upcoming infrastructure legislation to expand intercity rail connections in the Southeast region, and comment on such initiatives if you see fit?
Thank you. Yes, I'd welcome a chance to work with you on this. I think many of the most compelling opportunities for strong rail connections are in the South and the Southeast. And as you mentioned, it's not just the cities at the endpoints of these routes, but those in between, Macon on the one route, the Athens or Commerce communities in the other. All of these could unlock opportunity throughout the region. And when that happens, makes the country as a whole stronger, which is part of why the President's jobs plan includes such robust resources to expand access to quality rail in the U.S.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about infrastructure and transit in Metro Atlanta. First, about the MARTA system, and then about the Beltline project. As you well know, and as we've discussed since the mid-1960s, MARTA has been helping folks get around Metro Atlanta, but particularly as the pace of growth of the metro area has risen in the last couple of decades, we've chronically underinvested in this vital transit system. There is great interest in expanding bus rapid transit to connect, for example, destinations in Clayton and DeKalb and Gwinnett counties. Also discussed rail extensions. Will you commit to working with my office, the city of Atlanta, and relevant regional planning authorities in the state of Georgia to develop a comprehensive plan to strengthen and expand MARTA service?
Absolutely. As we've discussed, both familiar routes and resources in MARTA and new possibilities around bus rapid transit can do a lot to alleviate congestion, expand opportunity, and of course that has climate benefits and air quality benefits too. So we're always eager to find new ways to partner on that. And again, glad that the President's American Jobs Plan has the resources we need to allow local authorities not just to hold on to what they've got, but to actually plan for the future and expand what's available to those they serve.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And touching on the Beltline initiative, you know, there are over 150 infrastructure projects nationwide that reuse existing or abandoned infrastructure and transit infrastructure, reimagining and reutilizing this space to create new mobility and quality of life. And the Atlanta Beltline, 7 of a 22-mile loop of former freight rail have already been transformed into a multi-use trail with transit capacity, affordable housing, parks, and green space planned. There's been more than $7.9 billion in private investment in this initiative. I'd like the federal government to get involved in helping to complete this project. Will you please meet with my office in coming weeks to discuss what we can do to advance completion of the Beltline? And I am so looking forward to welcoming you to Georgia tomorrow, and I think we'll have the opportunity to inspect it.
Thank you. Yes, really looking forward to a chance to see it in person. Welcome a chance to connect with your office further on how to encourage development. And we take a lot of pride in the federal dollars, I think in the Tiger program that went into helping establish the earlier phases of the Beltline. Whenever you can reuse and repurpose resources like that, as you mentioned, it often can unlock private dollars that follow the public investments that have been made. And of course, we need to focus on making sure it's accessible, that the housing that grows up around it is affordable. And I know that that you've been emphatic about the importance of that, and eager to see it for myself.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. And finally, to touch on the importance of completing the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project. This is the deepening from approximately 42 to 47 feet of the Savannah River at the entrance of the Port of Savannah. You and I discussed this earlier this week. I was in Savannah a couple of weeks ago meeting with Mayor Johnson, the Port Authorities, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This project has been consistently over budget and behind schedule, but we're now very, very close to completing it. I secured a commitment from the president's nominee for the deputy position at OMB a couple of months ago to prioritize this project. Mr. Secretary, will you commit to working with me and Mayor Van Johnson of Savannah to ensure that Savannah is timely and fully completing this deepening and expansion project, I hope by the end of this year?
Yes, look forward to working with you on this. This is something of not just regional, but I think national interest, given the size and capacity of this port, and it's important to us to see it through to timely completion.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff.
Thank
you, Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Chairman Brown, and thank you both, Secretary Fudge and Secretary Buttigieg, for your leadership. Congratulations on your appointment. On Monday, I had an opportunity to speak with Nuria Fernandez, the nominee for Federal Transit Administrator, about the Capital Investment Grant Program and the need to invest more in both urban and rural public transportation service for communities that need that investment. Secretary Buttigieg, I look forward to working with you on these critical transportation priorities, but today I want to talk to you about reconnecting communities, literally reconnecting them, and reversing the damage done to predominantly poor and Black communities during the construction of our interstate highway system. You and I have spent a little time together down in Atlanta and at Ebenezer Church, where I served. Are you familiar? Do you remember the downtown connector or Interstate 75, 85 that runs through the core of Atlanta right next to my church?
Yes, I remember.
Yeah. And are you aware that its construction in the 1950s and 1960s displaced or separated historic Black neighborhoods in Atlanta? It literally split the Sweet Auburn Avenue with all of these Black businesses that were thriving, split them in two.
Yes, unfortunately, this is a pattern that a lot of federally supported highways in that period followed, and I'm aware that that had enormous impact in that community.
And the irony is that this interstate that we're talking about, 75, 85 in Atlanta, is called, ironically, the connector. And it did exactly the opposite, separating these precious neighborhoods in Atlanta. Given this unfortunate history, what responsibility do you think that we as policymakers have today when making new physical infrastructure investments?
Well, I think when you break something, you have a responsibility to put it right. And the reality is that federal transportation policy broke something, broke a community in two in an important way. And that creates a responsibility for us today to use resources to create connections where there had been divisions. We know how to do it. At least in dialogue with the community, we can arrive at ways to do it. And it's one of the reasons why the Thriving Communities Initiative that's envisioned in the President's American Jobs Plan creates real dollars to make that possible. This is clearly a responsibility of the same federal government that in some cases created these problems. But it's an opportunity not just to mend what was broken, but I think to lift up entire communities through the benefits that would come from them being better connected.
And can you speak a little bit about some ways we can redress these inequities?
Well, I think it, of course, needs to be tailored to the specific community, and I'd welcome an opportunity to speak with you more about some of the ideas that have emerged locally. Sometimes it has to do with re-envisioning where a highway or piece of infrastructure ought to go. Other times it's leaving it intact, but finding ways to connect across, above, or beneath it. And again, these are the kinds of things that in the jobs plan, which, for example, includes $5 billion to make sure that future projects help rather than harm on transportation equity and greater connectivity. These are the things we could be doing together, provided we had the resources to work with. And I welcome the opportunity both to secure those resources and to put them to good use.
Great. And you're absolutely right. I agree with you that you have a responsibility, the federal government has a responsibility to repair what it actually broke. And it's the reason I'm an original co-sponsor of the Reconnecting Communities Act. And I know you're coming to Atlanta tomorrow. So we'll get a chance to see this highway again, ironically called the Connector, with me and Senator Will you commit to working with me and my colleagues on this legislation to ensure that projects that seek to reconnect these communities in Georgia, like the more appropriately named Midtown Connector and Project Stitch in Atlanta, as well as the reimagining of the I-16 off-ramp in Savannah, my hometown, are realized?
Yes, I welcome a chance to work with you on this. And again, this is in the spirit of a major administration and departmental priority. And so I appreciate the work that's gone on and the leadership already to put together policies that would make a difference.
I'll talk to you a bit about the meetings.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to engaging Secretary Fudge. Wanted to talk to her about the social determinants of health, but I know it's something she's passionate about, and we'll have time to talk about it in the near future.
Thank you, Secretary Warnock, and she absolutely is. We've all had those conversations with her. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Secretary Fudge, thank you. Good to see you again. Secretary Buttigieg, you too. Thanks for discussing why we need transformational coordinated investments in our housing and transportation infrastructure. These investments we know will create good American jobs and access to opportunity while helping communities become more equitable and affordable and resilient. I want to clarify one thing, then a brief question, last question to each of you. When people say labor costs, as you heard in this committee, what they mean is American workers and fair wages. These jobs will pay good wages that allow workers to live with dignity in their communities. They're helping to build. They will spend those wages in their communities at local businesses. Labor costs are the way people make a living. I want to close by bringing our discussion back to those workers we serve and what this investment would mean in their lives. I know you both understand dignity of work and what this means. So my question is more kind of an attitudinal, sort of visceral response perhaps might work. When was the moment, each of you, and I'll start this time with you, Secretary Buttigieg. I've started with Secretary Fudge more often in this. When was the moment you realized we needed a transformative infrastructure investment in this country? When did you first have that sort of vision and inspiration for each of you?
Well, every mayor does battle with potholes. And I remember early in my time as mayor looking at the condition of our streets and roads, the work that needed to be done, and trying to do some mental math about what it would take to have a great road network in our city. And turning to my public works director and asking, with the funding we have, how long would it take for us to redo every lane mile of street in the city? And he let me know it would be on the order of 50 to 100 years. And I thought, great, all I need is some kind of asphalt to be invented that in our snowy climate could survive more than 8 or 10 years. And that was just one example of many that showed to me what it would mean, not just to have more funding for the things we'd been doing all along, like repaving roads, but more alternatives for how people can get around. And I think all of us have had moments like that again and again, especially when traveling overseas and seeing the kinds of transportation infrastructure that citizens in other countries take for granted. I remember being a student in the UK on a train that they don't consider high speed, they just consider it regular speed, and realizing maybe for the first time in a visceral sense that we as Americans have come to settle for less. And as somebody who believes in the idea of Americans having the best in the world at whatever we do, and that certainly ought to include transportation, that pricked my national pride a little bit and left me motivated to make sure that whether we're talking about roads or rail or housing or energy or anything else, we've got the best in the world. And that's what I think the president's American Jobs Plan can allow us finally to do in our lifetime.
Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Fudge, when did it sort of jump into your mind, the need for transformational investment in housing and infrastructure?
Really, probably from the day I started to work. I realized how it would take me 4 buses to get to downtown Cleveland to go to work. And the only effective way to do it was by car. I would have to carpool with people because they didn't have cars. And then we started in our infinite wisdom to start to build more and more roads into the exurbs, way beyond the suburbs, where people could not get to work. There was no transportation to get them there, so they had to have a car. And so you start to think about it, maybe not in the way I think about it now, but I knew there was a problem then. And it has taken us an awful long time to get to this point to try to address it.
Thank you. Excellent answers. Thank you both for being here. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due by the close of business next Thursday, May 27th. For witnesses, please submit your responses to questions for the record 45 days from today. Thank you both very much for being here. Thank you both very much for your public service. Good to see you both. The committee is adjourned. Best wishes.
Thank you.